On RN Summer, glad you could make it for the Philosopher's Zone. Joe Gelanisi with you. Today, what makes a person?
Instead of having a bunch of criteria, maybe sentience, self-consciousness, the ability to form preferences, to determine whether what you've got in front of you is a person or not. Ticks this box, ticks this... Oh, doesn't tick that box. Sorry, doesn't count as a person. I'm very unhappy with that kind of approach to personhood, which is kind of an orthodoxy in analytical philosophy these days, and it makes me very nervous. There's a great deal about it that just seems to me to be untrue to our experience.
Philosopher Timothy Chappell on a problem that's kept philosophers awake at night since the ancients. What is a person? It's been at the centre of some stoushes, from slavery to women's equality, the status of animals to the right to choose. Personhood creates dilemmas. Take New South Wales, for instance, with Zoe's Law, which tries to make legal sense of personhood in terms of crime and its victims. It's a tough one. For Timothy Chappell, though, personhood needs a little more thought beyond ticking off the checklist.
I have a big suspicion of a lot of the systematising that goes on in philosophy. Philosophers are too quick to systematise and too quick to ignore the data of experience. The way we experience the world is very rich and full of all kinds of ethical information that I think theory can very easily squeeze out. Very interested as a philosopher in my own experience of interpersonal relations, of friendship, of what it means to recognise another being as a person. And in all the cases where we're not dealing with what most of us would call a full-on person, but something that exhibits all sorts of interesting personal qualities, like dogs, for example. I think animals are extraordinarily interesting from the point of view of thinking about personhood.
So if we just start with the basis that for you, the relationship precedes the individual. This is the key to it, isn't it?
I think that's the key idea, is that instead of having a bunch of criteria, maybe sentience, self-consciousness, the ability to form preferences, which you use as a kind of checklist to determine whether what you've got in front of you is a person or not. So you go through, ticks this box, ticks this... Oh, doesn't tick that box. Sorry, doesn't count as a person. Or ticks all these boxes, but not quite enough for it to count as a person. I'm very unhappy with that kind of approach to personhood, which is kind of an orthodoxy in analytical philosophy these days, thanks to the work of people like Peter Singer. It's pretty much a standard view, and it makes me very nervous. There's a great deal about it that just seems to me to be untrue to our experience. And what they're talking about as criteria for personhood, boxes that you tick to establish whether you've got a person or not, and if you don't tick them, no person. It seems to me that actually what we're talking about is, it's a bit of a poncy phrase, but I'll have to use it anyway, dimensions of interpretation. So we come to a person, what we take to be a person, with all this in the background. If you want a Kantian analogy, it's like what we bring in the way of the synthetic a priori to our encounters with the world. We come to other individual human beings in particular with all those ideas about how we might interpret them, about what kind of sense they might be making, which have to do with sentience, self-consciousness, the rest of it. We bring that to the table. It's there before we start. We already assume that what we're dealing with is a person. There's no question of going in and saying, right, is this a person or isn't it? We're not detecting persons in that kind of sort of pseudo-Cartesian way. It's not a kind of exercise in deduction that leads us to the conclusion, this is a person.
Interesting, you've mentioned Descartes there, and you write a lot about Descartes and the idea of the cogito, and this is the way, I guess, that has underlined the notion of the individual first, and then relationships second. Did Descartes get that wrong?
Well, I think Descartes, as he's often read, got that wrong, certainly. The standard reading of Descartes says that Descartes had this kind of mad individualism where you start as the solitary figure in the middle of the universe and you pull yourself up by your own epistemic bootstraps. You learn to understand the world around you as You make all these deductions to the nature of the world. First of all, you decide there is a world, then you decide there are other people in it, and by inference and inference and inference, you gradually build up this picture, which I sometimes call the deep thought picture of the world, after the famous computer in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, who's so intelligent that they make this computer, deep thought, and before they can even get round to switching off, he's already deduced the existence of income tax and rice pudding, just starting from the cogito. And it's a little bit like that kind of crazy romantic hero, solitary individualism picture that you're supposed to get from Descartes. And I don't think that's true to our experience. I think it's an understandable fantasy of power to have if you are yourself a philosopher. But I don't think it's how life actually is.
You've used that term experience a few times. You're coming to this not from an a priori position, but from one of phenomenology, from one of the experience of being human.
Yes, that's very much what I want to do. And of course, experience, the study of our experience phenomenology, is full of traps, because you can't repeat experiences. No two people have the same experiences. All of that is true. And in many ways, it's safer to flee from the rough ground of thinking about experience with all its complications and knots and difficulties to somewhere drier and more abstract, where you can just plonk, 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 lay down a few abstract propositions of extreme generality, which are your starting point. But I like things to be a bit messier than that, because I think that's more realistic. I want to start with experience, and when philosophy goes away from experience, it very quickly starts making me uneasy. I start feeling that things are being lost in the wash, things are not being represented, which we all know are there. And there's always this feeling of yes, but, ... that you get from a lot of philosophy. When you read it, you think, well, yes, I see where you're going, I see what you're saying, but there's something you're leaving out. And I'm not sure I can articulate it, but it's there.
There is, and the yes, but is a very powerful way of putting it, but there is a yes, but in your argument as well, in that the individual also seems like it belongs as a way of understanding the world, that to get a relational experience happening before that is hard to come at, to understand.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that a lot of what we do, I don't want to deny for a minute that a lot of what we do is based on our individuality and starts from our individuality. One of the words I most resist in philosophy is the word all. I think it's very dangerous. We always think that we have to go for the universal quantifier. We have to say things which are true. One counterexample shoots us down. Well, actually, just as a matter of tactics, we do better to go for generalizations that aren't preceded by the word all. But when we talk about individual experience, I do always want to ask the question, well, where do those individuals come from? And unless you're talking about a few extraordinary cases like wolfmen or solitary individuals who really do grow up in the woods and the caves, as Rousseau describes, all on their own, for most of us what happens is we start off, we learn to be individuals because someone treats us as an individual, by treating us as if each of us was an independent subject who's capable of autonomy, of operating for him or herself in the world as an autonomous individual. We get to be those autonomous individuals because we're treated that way by someone else. So underneath autonomy and underneath activity, there's passivity and dependency. And I think that's the truth about our lives, which we must never forget. It's beautifully brought out just in the very title of a marvellous book by Alistair MacIntyre, Dependent Rational Animals. I think that's a three-word, almost perfect analysis of what we are.
You used developmental psychology there to help with your argument. And does developmental psychology then go against a criterialist approach in that regard?
I think it does. And two people whom I'd appeal to in this regard are Kenneth Kay and Alva Noe. Kenneth Kay, a while back, 1982 I think it was, wrote a classic book called The Mental and Social Life of Babies. And his argument there is that a lot of theorists of child psychology and developmental psychology have gone wrong precisely because they start with individualism. They start by saying, well, you've got this Cartesian cognizer. Each child is a Cartesian cognizer. How the heck, having started there, does that child manage to reach out and recognize mindedness in other beings? And it's a little bit like the old proverb that we have in Britain and Ireland. If that's where you want to get to, I wouldn't start from there. If you start from the position that we're Cartesian cognizers, you get tremendous difficulties. And what Kenneth Kay does in that wonderful book is he turns this on its head and he says, actually, it's not like that. We learn to be cognizers, we learn to be individuals because we're cognized, because we're already in someone else's view. And that's how our ability to make all these deductions gets going. That's where it starts from. And the Alvanoe book is called Out of Our Heads, and it's much more recent. And it's fundamentally, I suppose, it's a sort of neo-Wittgensteinian approach to epistemology. It's not really a book about developmental psychology, but what Alvanoe says there is that one of the things which we need to recognise as primary in epistemology is our own ability to interact with the world around us, our own ability to be embedded agents within the world. And that embeddedness, for Alvanoe too, it starts off from the very beginning. You could say we're part of the background before we emerge into the foreground. We're already part of the environment that we're in, and we learn to be ourselves. We learn to emerge from that background, and that's where personality and individuality comes from.
Timothy Chappell, Director of the Open University Ethics Centre, on becoming a person. Next, the influence of 20th century thinker Emmanuel Levinas on Chappell's views. Must be the Philosopher's Zone, here on RN.
One of the great privileges of being an academic is that you get to spend your time reading books which are sometimes enthralling. I stress the word sometimes. Again, I wouldn't want to say always there. But picking up Levinas for the first time about 2 years ago now and beginning to read him was, for me, absolutely thrilling, because although Levinas writes rather difficult prose, and it's all a bit convoluted, in homage to Heidegger perhaps, what he's saying, when you get to the gist of it, when you get to see that what he's saying is that we come to be ourselves because we start off in relationship. Actually, I find that an extremely exciting idea, and I think the other great thing about Levinas is that he's a phenomenologist. He's interested in experience, and he explicitly rejects the whole idea of system building. His name for that is ontology, which isn't a word I'd want to use for it, but he calls it ontology, and he says we mustn't have this system building. What we must have, instead of this attempt to control everything by nailing it down in definitions and theses and propositions and systems, instead of that quest for power, what we need in philosophy is what he calls metaphysics. And metaphysics is the going beyond, as the word meta suggests. You're always on a kind of pilgrimage. And so you've got two different pictures of knowledge there. One is knowledge as power, controlling things, systematizing, putting them in boxes. And the other is knowledge as pilgrimage. And it's an infinite pilgrimage, because you can never find out all there is to find out.
Isn't that knowledge as power, though? Isn't that just trying to clarify the world, make it as lucid and understandable as we can possibly make it? It's a discipline, really.
I think that that's a noble ambition. I think that clarifying things, making them as lucid as possible, that's where we're all trying to go all the time, and God knows it's hard. But that, perhaps there are just two conflicting ideals here, both of which you need a bit of. You need to find a way of reconciling those two dimensions of what philosophy needs to be. It does need to be lucid. It does need to be clear about the nature of things. It also needs to be true to experience. And I do worry with some philosophers, perhaps Hobbes is the most obvious one. Nietzsche, of course, is so transparent about this that actually he's kind of self-parodic. But in a writer like Hobbes, it does seem that knowledge is power is exactly what he means. He wants to give you a system that will enable you to control and manipulate the reality around you. And that's perhaps less obvious in Leviathan than it is in some of Hobbes' other works, like De Corpore. But Hobbes, it seems to me, is a quintessential knowledge is power. Get the ability to manipulate the world around you, and that's what you need. And that seems to me is a sadly isolated kind of view. But one of the things I love about Hobbes is his lucidity. I mean, he's as clear as they come. He writes wonderfully clear prose. But I don't like the idea that knowledge is just a matter of control and manipulation. That seems to me to be less than we're capable of.
To the question of animals and to the question of the other, can animals be the other? Can they be the part of that relational experience?
I think they can, yes. I think what we get from animals is extraordinarily interesting, and I think there is often a danger which, in debate, I think writers like Singer are very keen to get their opponents in this kind of trouble. But I think the danger is genuine too. There is a danger of making it sound as if what you're saying is that only humans matter. morally, and it's only with humans that we can have deep and valuable relationships. And I think that, coming back to experience, is just obviously and patently false. There can be, and there have been, plenty of individuals for whom their most significant relationships were with beings of other species, such as dogs. What I'd want to say is that the place of other human beings in our form of life, to use a Wittgensteinian phrase, is different and is unique. There is something special about the way we relate to other humans. I think that much is true. That doesn't mean that there can't be a very special relationship with a dog or a horse or I mean, Ray Gator has the example of a cockatoo as being an animal with which he, in childhood, had a relationship that for him was life-shaping. What I do think is important is that we get clear about the ways in which species are morally relevant, because I think we lose something very important if we lose sight of that idea, that what species you're in does actually have some basic moral significance. And I think that idea is just true, and I think that the campaign against speciesism has often been based on misunderstandings of what you're saying, if you say that species membership matters morally.
It's interesting because you do use the term, is it the prime moral constituency?
Yes. The
prime moral constituency, which in itself suggests a hierarchy, which I assume is the thing that is the difficult thing for people who claim speciesism is occurring.
I think perhaps one should think not so much about a hierarchy as a majority. It's just the case that most of our interactions, our moral interactions, are with other human beings. For most of us, especially those of us who live in cities, that's always the case, and that's always going to be the case. We do relate more to our conspecifics. And for most of us, those relationships are what make the difference between a happy life and an unhappy life.
To the question of the wolf boy, what happens in the situation of the wolf boy, the lone adult being brought up in the wild by another species?
Well, we should look at the data there, and as I understand it, what actually happens when you have someone who is brought up by wolves instead of human beings is that you get someone who by normal human standards is pretty disturbed, and someone who's not capable of language, someone who behaves in all sorts of what we would perhaps regard as pretty savage ways, someone also who has at most a fairly compromised sense of himself as an individual. And it's only when a wolf boy gets drawn into a human society that he begins to change. But the striking thing is that he does change once he gets drawn into a human society. And if you bring a wolf into a human society, yes, it will change, but it won't change. There's no prospect of its changing into the kind of being that we'd entrust with the vote. It won't change into another human person, just like us, no matter how far things go. So in that sense, I think you can see that the fact that a wolf boy is a member of the human species, but a member of the human species that hasn't been subjected to the normal kind of socialization. I think the empirical data support quite strongly the idea that what you've got there is a basic human nature, which makes its contribution to what you should say morally about it, and also the socialization, which makes its contribution. The two come together.
Yes, because I can see the counter-argument that the wolf boy has grown up as within wolf society and has some sense of being a wolf boy. But what you're saying is that there is a form of life, being human, which you can flourish in if certain things are met, and it hasn't been met for that boy.
Yes, it looks like the wolf boy is usually being brought into the argument because what that example is supposed to do is to show that you can develop a sense of individuality without having that taught to you by other human beings. And I would say, well, I'm very happy indeed to be a hostage to the empirical facts, because philosophy depends, moral philosophy depends, on the empirical facts to a much greater extent than most of us suppose. It's not an armchair business. It is about seeing what actually happens and what differences actually make what differences. I'm happy to be a hostage to fortune, to the empirical data about the wolf boy, but it seems to me that what they show is that the wolf boy is not a counterexample to the thesis that a normal sense of self in a human being comes from being socialized and comes from being taught that sense of self by your carers in infancy.
Nevertheless, the criteria view of what it is to be a person is the one that has the upper hand, hasn't it?
Well, in debate, it's the commonest view, and if you try and present an alternative to it in a lot of analytical philosophy, the response is usually just, well, I don't know about usually, but the response is very often just incomprehension. People don't know what the alternative would be. They simply can't see it. They think that you're proposing a different kind of criterialism. They think that you just have some different criterion of personhood to offer. And, well, it takes time to change things, but I hope that this aspect of analytical philosophy can be changed, because I think it has the potential to do real damage to us as a society. Well, I was going to ask the next question, which is probably the most loaded one, but this will have implications. Your view has implications for, let's say, the beginning and the ends of life. Absolutely, yes, it does. I think it's important to stress that my motivation for doing this is not actually a pro-life one. I think that abortion and euthanasia are both extremely tricky issues, but that isn't why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because it seems to me that something has gone seriously haywire in the way that analytical philosophers think about personhood. What my argument shows, what this argument shows about abortion and infanticide, is that it's not okay to perform abortions and kill very small babies simply because they're not persons and therefore they don't count morally. Now, Singer's arguments very clearly do have that conclusion, and it seems to me that that conclusion is one which even pro-choice people ought to be decidedly alarmed about. If I was wanting to present a pro-choice argument, it wouldn't be on that basis at all. It would be on the basis of thinking about the kinds of differences that you get between cases and the very difficult situations that pregnant young women can find themselves in. If I wanted to be a pro-choicer, that's where I would go for my argument. I wouldn't dream of saying, well, small babies and unborn babies simply aren't persons at all, because that seems to me to be violently counterintuitive and a far stronger conclusion than actually a good argument for a pro-choice conclusion really needs. As I say, I'm addressing the issue of personhood. I'm not addressing the issue of abortion, although obviously the argument cuts out one way of arguing for abortion, and the same with euthanasia and end-of-life issues. What I'm wanting to say about persons is that persons are individual members of the human species, and that the criteria, which are supposed to be the test for whether something is a person, according to Singer and his allies, those criterial properties, as they call them, or as they think of them, are actually neither criterial, because we don't have a checklist approach, nor properties. They're actually ideals. They're actually dimensions of interpretation of human persons. Now, we have enough space in the way we think about persons to allow that somebody might fail pretty radically by one or more of those criteria and still be a person. It's a fact about human beings that all of us in the end get old, get ill, and die. And when we're ill, when we're dying, we lose all sorts of capacities that normally we're capable of exercising. I do think that there is such a thing as a time to let go. I do think there's a time to recognise that another human being doesn't really have much of a future. And I wouldn't for a moment want to come in with some kind of high-handed a priori approach and say to individuals in those kinds of situations, no, you must go on doing this or that to keep this person alive. I think there are situations where letting go is pretty much the only sane alternative. But I also think it's true that amongst the most basic kinds of demands that other human beings make of us, the most basic moral demands that other human beings make of us, is the demand that we respect them. And I think respect is still something that we owe to other human beings, even when we can see that it's pretty much lights out. Timothy Chappell into the deep end of defining a person, coming face to face with some hot-button issues of our time. He's the director of the Open University Ethics Centre. You can hear today's program again by visiting our webpage. Go to RN First and follow the signs to the Philosopher's Zone. While you're there, you can listen, download, comment and browse the library. Thanks to the Philosopher's Zone team, Diane Dean and Joe Wallace. I'm Joe Gilanisi. See you next week.